My name is Elena. I sat in the velvet wingback chair in the corner of our living room, shrouded in a darkness that felt heavy enough to touch. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline was a grid of electric indifference, cold and distant against the black void of the lake. As an architect, I had spent my 34 years studying structure and stability, learning how to keep massive weights from collapsing under their own pressure. Tonight, however, I was only interested in controlled demolition. The silence in the penthouse was absolute, a held breath before the scream, until the private elevator chimed with a cheerful ding that sounded obscene in the quiet. Lucas walked in, my husband of 10 years, the chief financial officer of Vanguard Horizons, stepped across the threshold with a spring in his step that betrayed his performance before it had even begun. Lucas walked in. My husband of 10 years, the chief financial officer of Vanguard Horizons, stepped across the threshold with a spring in his step that betrayed his performance before it had even begun. He dropped his leather weekender bag with a heavy thud, exhaling a long, dramatic sigh meant to signal exhaustion. He did not see me immediately. He loosened his tie, rolling his neck as if carrying the weight of the global economy on his shoulders, but the scent that wafted ahead of him was not the stale, recirculated air of a pressurized cabin or the damp wool of a rainy city. It was the smell of expensive sunscreen, sea salt, and a crisp citrus cologne that I had never bought for him. He reached for the light switch, flooding the foyer with harsh illumination, and finally spotted me. He jumped, his hand flying to his chest in a gesture that would have been comical if I did not hate him so much. He smiled, that practiced corporate smile that used to make my knees weak. He started his script immediately. He told me Seattle was a nightmare. He complained that the investment seminar ran 18 hours a day and that the rain never stopped for 2 weeks. He claimed he had not seen the sun since he left O'Hare Airport. I let him talk. I sat perfectly still, swirling the dark red wine in my glass, dissecting him with a clinical detachment. He was lying with every breath. I saw the distinct pale band of skin across the bridge of his nose where his designer sunglasses had rested for hours under a blazing sun. I saw the fine grains of white silica sand caught in the stitching of his Italian loafers. I saw the relaxed, loose tension in his shoulders that only came from 2 weeks of massages and day drinking, not high-stakes financial negotiations. I waited for a pause in his monologue about market volatility. When he finally stopped to breathe, expecting sympathy, I looked him dead in the eye. My voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it cut through the air like a scalpel. I asked him if he had managed to wipe that burner phone yet, or if the federal search warrant had executed the moment his plane touched the tarmac. The effect was instantaneous and biological. It was fascinating to watch the blood drain from a human face in real time. The healthy golden glow of his tan turned into a sickly waxen gray within seconds. His pupils dilated, swallowing the iris. The hand holding his suit jacket went slack, and the jacket slid to the floor in a heap. He stopped breathing. I could see the gears grinding in his panic-stricken mind. Lucas was arrogant, but he was not stupid. He knew exactly what he had done at Vanguard Horizons. He knew about the funds he had been siphoning off to hide his double life and the secret accounts he used to fund this little escapade. He believed, in that terrified moment, that his corporate veil had been pierced. He was not thinking about our marriage. He was thinking about prison. He began to pat his pockets frantically, his hands trembling so violently he could barely coordinate his fingers. He was looking for his phone, desperate to check his offshore accounts. Desperate to see if his life was over. He looked like a cornered animal, gasping for air, his chest heaving as the walls of his own guilt closed in on him. I watched him crumble. I took another slow sip of wine, feeling the cool glass against my lip. He had no idea that there was no search warrant. There were no federal agents waiting in the lobby. There was no indictment sitting on a judge's desk. Not yet. He was terrified of the law. But he was making a grave miscalculation. The law gives you a lawyer. The law gives you a trial. I was going to give him neither. The police were not coming for him, but what I had planned for the next few weeks would make him wish he was safely behind bars. Looking at the stranger trembling on my expensive rug, it was hard to reconcile him with the boy I met 12 years ago. My mind drifted back to a dusty, dimly lit library in Boston. We were both 22, drowning in student loans and ambition. He was not wearing a $3,000 suit then. He was wearing a frayed sweater that smelled of cheap coffee and old books. He bumped into my table, knocking over a stack of architectural history books, and spent the next 20 minutes apologizing with a shy, clumsy charm that disarmed me completely. That Lucas, the Lucas of the past, was a man of quiet dreams and profound humility. He walked everywhere because he could not afford bus fare, yet he never complained. I remember the day he proposed. He did not drop to one knee on a yacht. He did it on a park bench in the middle of winter. I found out later that he had sold his bicycle, his only mode of transportation, just to buy the modest gold band that now sat heavy on my finger. He walked 5 miles to work every day for a month so I could have that ring. It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for me. Our first years of marriage were defined by a struggle that felt like an adventure. We lived in a drafty 4th-floor walk-up where the heating pipes clanged like church bells and the shower never got truly hot. We ate instant noodles 4 nights a week, sitting on the floor because we could not afford a dining table, sketching our future empire on the back of napkins. I would draw houses I wanted to build, and he would calculate how we would pay for them. We were a fortress of two, invincible against the world. I made the choice willingly. I put my own architectural aspirations on a slow simmer, taking mundane drafting jobs to pay the bills so Lucas could pursue his master's degree. I ironed his shirts, typed his papers, and whispered encouragement when the competitive world of finance tried to chew him up. I was his anchor. I believed that his success would be our success. I pushed him toward the light, never realizing I was slowly stepping into his shadow. The change did not happen overnight. It was a slow erosion, like water wearing down stone. As the promotions came, so did the armor. The soft sweaters were replaced by bespoke suits that cost more than our first car. The intimate dinners at home were traded for loud, hollow cocktail parties where men measured each other by their wristwatches. He stopped marveling at the simple things. A sunset was no longer beautiful to him unless it was viewed from a VIP balcony. He began to speak of people as assets or liabilities, losing the empathy that had once defined him. Yet, I remained the foolish, faithful wife. I told myself he was just tired. I told myself the pressure of the market was turning him into steel, and he needed me to be the softness. I continued to leave sticky notes on the bathroom mirror every morning, telling him I was proud of him, telling him I loved him. Most days. I found them in the trash can by the evening, crumpled and unread. Then came Vanguard Horizons. That company was the final nail in the coffin of the man I loved. It was a shark tank disguised as a corporate headquarters, and to survive there, Lucas decided he had to become the biggest predator. He became pragmatic to the point of cruelty. The cracks in our foundation turned into gaping holes. He forgot our 10th anniversary, dismissing my hurt feelings as childishness because he was closing a deal. He began to snap at me for breathing too loudly while he watched the news. He started making subtle, stinging comments about my appearance. He would glance at my waistline and suggest a salad, or look at my comfortable clothes with a sneer of distaste, asking why I could not dress more like the wives of his partners. I absorbed it all, convinced that if I just loved him enough, the boy from the library would eventually come back. I was wrong. That boy was dead, and the man standing before me now was the stranger who had killed him. It started with a name that began to infiltrate our dinner conversations like a subtle poison. Monica. She was the new director of external relations at Vanguard Horizons, 26 years old, sharp as a tack, and apparently indispensable. At first, the praise was professional. Lucas would mention that Monica was efficient or that she had a fresh perspective on client acquisition. But soon, the frequency became suffocating. Monica understood his vision. Monica was the only one who could handle the high-profile accounts. Monica was his right hand. Her name hung in the air between us, a ghostly third presence at our dining table that I could not exorcise. Then came the digital walls. For 10 years, Lucas and I had shared everything, including our device passcodes. Suddenly, his phone had a new 6-digit lock that he refused to share, claiming it was a mandatory security protocol from the IT department. He started taking his phone into the bathroom when he showered, placing the screen face down on the marble vanity. He switched his cologne from the subtle sandalwood scent I had always loved to a heavy, aggressive musk fragrance that cost $300 a bottle. He began grooming himself with a meticulous intensity that he had not shown since our first dates, checking his reflection in every window we passed. The first crack in my wall of denial appeared on a Tuesday morning. I was preparing to take his suits to the dry cleaners when I felt a stiff piece of paper in the inside pocket of his navy blazer. It was a receipt from a high-end jeweler on Michigan Avenue for a diamond pendant necklace costing $4,500. My heart hammered against my ribs. I waited for him to come home, my hands shaking as I held the damning slip of paper. When I confronted him, he did not even blink. He laughed, a smooth, practiced sound that made my stomach turn, and told me I was being ridiculous. He explained that his boss, the CEO, had asked him to pick it up for his wife because he was stuck in board meetings all day. He made me feel small for asking, chiding me for my insecurity and lack of trust. I wanted to believe him. I desperately wanted to believe him. I told myself I was being paranoid, a jealous housewife inventing demons where there were none. I tried to bridge the growing abyss between us. I booked a table at his favorite steakhouse. I bought new lingerie. One night, I tried to initiate intimacy, reaching for him in the dark, starving for a connection. He pulled away as if I were contagious, rolling over and muttering that he was exhausted and had an early start. The rejection stung worse than a physical blow. Then came the announcement of the trip. He told me he had to attend the Global Financial Summit in Seattle for 15 days. He stressed the high-level security of the event, telling me that phones would be confiscated during the sessions and that he would be unreachable for long stretches due to the sensitive nature of the merger talks. He said it was a career-defining opportunity that he could not miss. I nodded, swallowing the lump of unease in my throat. Like a fool. I helped him pack. I checked the weather forecast for Seattle, seeing nothing but relentless rain and temperatures in the low 50s. I packed his heavy wool sweaters, his waterproof trench coat, and thick socks. I made sure he had his allergy medication. While I folded his gray cashmere scarf, he sat on the edge of the bed, texting. He was smiling at the screen, a small, secretive curve of his lips that vanished the instant I looked up. When I asked who it was, he snapped that it was just work emails, his voice sharp with irritation. The drive to the airport was suffocatingly silent. At the drop-off curb, the car engine was still running. I leaned over to kiss him goodbye, a ritual of a decade. He turned his head at the last second, so my lips grazed his cheek. He did not look at me. He grabbed his bag, muttered a quick goodbye, and strode toward the terminal doors without looking back once. He moved with an urgency that had nothing to do with missing a flight. He looked like a man escaping a prison, and I sat in the idling car, watching my husband run away from our marriage. The first few days of Lucas's absence were a strange mixture of relief and hollow loneliness. The penthouse felt vast without his restless energy. I tried to fill the silence with routine. I watered the fiddle-leaf figs, I reorganized my architectural drafts, and I cooked simple meals for one, eating them while standing at the kitchen island. I told myself this was good. I told myself the distance would reset us, that he would come back from Seattle with the rain washed out of his system, ready to be the man I married again. I was delusional. On the 5th day, my world imploded. It was a Thursday afternoon when my phone rang. It was my father's neighbor, her voice hysterical. She had found him collapsed in his garden. My father, the only family I had left since my mother passed, had suffered a massive heart attack. The drive to the hospital was a blur of panicked tears and ran red lights. I was hyperventilating. my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I needed Lucas. I needed his voice to tell me it would be okay. I needed his strength to hold me up because my own legs were failing me. I called him. It went straight to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I called 12 times in succession as I sprinted through the sterile white corridors of the emergency room. I sat in the waiting room, staring at the muted television, my phone clutched in my trembling hand like a lifeline. I texted him, "Dad is in critical condition. Please pick up. I need you." 10 minutes later, doctors say it looks bad. "Lucas, please. Where are you?" Silence. An hour later, a doctor with tired eyes walked toward me. He did not have to speak. I saw the answer in the slump of his shoulders. My father was gone. He had died alone in a cold room while I was filling out paperwork. I fell into a chair, a guttural sound tearing from my throat that did not sound human. I was an orphan. I was completely, utterly alone in the world. I reached for my phone one last time, desperate for my husband to share this crushing weight. The screen lit up, but not with a call from Lucas. It was a notification from our joint credit card app. Lucas had forgotten to disable the alerts on the supplementary card I rarely used. Transaction alert. The French Laundry, Yountville, California. Amount $850. I stared at the screen, my brain unable to process the data. The French Laundry was in Napa Valley. It was 2,000 miles south of Seattle. It was sunny in California. Another notification popped up. Transaction alert, Silver Oak Cellars, Oakville, California. Amount $420. The world stopped spinning. The grief that had been tearing me apart suddenly froze. The tears that were streaming down my face dried up instantly, replaced by a cold, paralyzing shock. My father had just taken his last breath in a sterile Chicago hospital room, and at that exact moment, my husband was sipping Cabernet Sauvignon in the California sunshine. He was not in a rainy conference room in Seattle. He was on a wine tour. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air out of my lungs. He was not working. He was vacationing. And he was ignoring my calls not because he was in a secure meeting, but because he did not want his holiday interrupted by his wife's tragedy. Something inside me snapped. It was not a loud break. It was a quiet, definitive fracture. The sobbing stopped. My breathing evened out. I sat up straight in the plastic hospital chair. The devastation of losing my father was still there, a massive, jagged hole in my chest. But around it, a fortress of ice was rapidly constructing itself. I looked at the phone screen one last time, memorizing the time and the amount. I did not call him again. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. I stood up, walked over to the nurse's station, and began to make the funeral arrangements myself. I was no longer a grieving daughter waiting to be saved. I was a woman with a debt to collect. My father's funeral was a desolate event, attended only by a handful of distant relatives and a few of his old chess partners. I stood alone by the open grave, dressed in black, my face hidden behind a veil that served less to mourn and more to conceal the cold rage hardening in my eyes. When my aunt asked where Lucas was, I lied with a smoothness that frightened me. I told her he was stuck in Singapore on a classified merger deal and that the government had grounded all communications. I protected his reputation even as he was destroying my life, but I was only buying time. I needed him to feel safe until he walked back through that door. Once the final shovel of earth fell, I went home and began my work. The grieving daughter died at the cemetery. The architect of his destruction returned to the penthouse. My first move was a simple phone call to the Fairmont Olympic in Seattle, the venue for the supposed summit. I asked to be connected to the room of Lucas Sterling. The receptionist politely informed me that there was no guest by that name registered at the hotel, nor was there any conference under the name Vanguard Horizons currently taking place. It was the confirmation I expected, yet it still stung like a fresh slap. I did not stop there. I hired a digital forensic investigator, a man I had used once for a background check on a contractor. I gave him access to our shared cloud accounts and authorized him to trace Lucas's digital footprint. Within 3 hours, he sent me a report that mapped out my husband's deceit with terrifying precision. Lucas had claimed he left his Audi in the long-term parking lot at O'Hare International Airport. The GPS tracker, which we had installed for insurance purposes, told a different story. The car was not at the airport. It was parked in a private garage in an upscale suburb 20 miles west, at an address registered to one Monica Reed. They had driven there together, left his car, and taken a private car service to the airport to fly to California. Armed with this knowledge, I cracked his home computer. He had changed the password, but Lucas was a creature of habit and arrogance. He had used the date of his promotion to CFO. Once inside, I found a hidden partition on the hard drive. It was a digital shrine to his infidelity. There were hundreds of high-resolution photos of him and Monica. I scrolled through images of them at 5-star resorts in Cabo, skiing in Aspen, and now, lounging by a pool in Napa Valley. They looked happy. They looked like a couple who did not have a care in the world, certainly not a wife planning a funeral back in Chicago. Then I found the financial records, and the betrayal deepened into financial violence. Buried in a folder labeled Tax Documents were PDFs of a deed of trust. Lucas and Monica had purchased a vineyard estate in Napa Valley 2 weeks ago. I looked at the funding source and felt the blood drain from my face. He had not just used his bonus. He had drained our entire joint savings account, over $400,000 that we had saved for our future children. Worse, he had taken out a second mortgage on our penthouse, forging my digital signature to secure the loan. He had leveraged the roof over my head to build a love nest for his mistress. The final blow was a document drafted by his personal lawyer. It was a divorce settlement strategy titled Operation Clean Break. I read through the bullet points with a nausea that sat heavy in my throat. His plan was to file for divorce the week he returned, citing irreconcilable differences. He had structured the assets to hide the Napa property and the drained accounts, intending to leave me with the debt from the penthouse while he walked away with the equity. I opened his archived chat logs with Monica. The dates corresponded to the days my father was dying. "She is such a burden," Lucas had written. "I am stuck in this gloom while you are the light," Monica had replied, asking about the money for their renovations. Lucas's response was the sentence that killed the last shred of my humanity. "Do not worry, babe. The old man is on his last legs. Once he kicks the bucket, Elena gets the inheritance, and I will figure out a way to funnel that into the vineyard before I serve her the papers." I did not scream. I did not throw the computer against the wall. I felt a deadly calm settle over me, a cold clarity that was sharper than any grief. I inserted a flash drive and copied everything. I printed the bank statements showing the unauthorized withdrawals. I printed the photos of them toasting with champagne. I printed the forged mortgage documents and the text messages where he wished for my father's death. I organized them into a neat, inch-thick stack of paper. This was no longer a marriage. It was a crime scene, and I had just gathered all the evidence I needed to hang him. Hysteria is for amateurs. Professional ruin requires a clear head and a steady hand. I did not throw his clothes off the balcony or scream his name into the void. Instead, I picked up the phone and dialed the number of Marcus Thorne. He was the most ruthless divorce attorney in Chicago, a man whose hatred for Vanguard Horizons was legendary because they had cheated his brother in a merger deal 5 years ago. I wired his retainer of $10,000 within the hour. When I explained the situation and showed him the digital evidence, he did not offer sympathy. He offered a strategy. We drafted an emergency motion to freeze all marital assets, ready to be filed the moment I gave the signal. But legal destruction was too impersonal. I wanted him to feel the ground crumble beneath his feet before the law even touched him. I walked into his walk-in closet, a shrine to his vanity. I selected his most prized possessions with the detachment of an estate liquidator, his collection of vintage watches, including the Patek Philippe he bought with his first big bonus, went into a duffel bag. His custom-made Japanese golf clubs followed. I drove to a high-end pawn shop on the outskirts of the city, a place that asked no questions and paid in cash. I sold $50,000 worth of his ego for a fraction of the price. I took that cash and walked into a bank, writing a cashier's check for a local women's shelter. The donation was made in honor of Monica Reed. I made sure the receipt would be mailed to her office. It felt poetic to use the proceeds of his infidelity to support women who had been victimized by men like him. My investigation into Monica yielded a diamond of information that I had not expected. She was not single. She was engaged to a man named Daniel, a pediatric surgeon with a kind face and a pristine reputation. Social media showed them looking adoringly at each other at their engagement party just 3 months ago. Poor Daniel. He was saving lives while his fiancée was destroying mine. I felt a pang of sympathy for him, but he was a necessary casualty in this war. I compiled a thick manila envelope containing the photos of Monica and Lucas in Napa, the hotel receipts with both their names, and a printout of their text messages. I did not write a note. The evidence spoke for itself. I paid a courier to deliver it to the surgical wing of his hospital with a priority tag. It would land on his desk right about the time Lucas was landing at O'Hare, back at the penthouse. I set the stage for the final act. I scrubbed the apartment until it smelled of lemon and antiseptic, erasing any trace of my grief. I went to the market and bought prime rib, rosemary, and truffles. I spent 3 hours cooking his favorite meal, the scent of roasting meat and rich red wine filling the air. It looked like a celebration. It looked like the warm, loving home of a devoted wife eagerly awaiting her husband. I chilled a bottle of vintage Bordeaux, setting 2 crystal glasses on the coffee table. I stood in front of the hallway mirror, smoothing the fabric of my black dress. It was the same dress I had worn on our last anniversary. The one he said made me look elegant. I looked at my reflection and practiced the line that would end his world. I rehearsed the tone, stripping away the anger until all that remained was a terrified, helpful concern. I needed him to believe that I was on his side. I needed him to believe that the threat was external, not sitting right across from him. I asked the empty room if he had wiped the phone. I asked if the warrant had been served. I repeated it until the lie tasted like the truth. I turned off the main lights, leaving only the soft, ambient glow of the floor lamps. The atmosphere was intimate, almost suffocating. I poured a glass of wine for myself and sat in the wingback chair facing the door. I checked my watch. It was 7 in the evening. The flight had landed 40 minutes ago. I heard the distant hum of the elevator gears engaging. My heart did not race. It slowed down, beating with the heavy, rhythmic thud of a war drum. I was no longer Elena the wife. I was the judge, the jury, and the executioner, waiting for the defendant to walk into the chamber. The elevator dinged. The key slid into the lock. I took a sip of wine and waited for the show to begin. We were back in the suffocating silence of the living room, the air thick with the scent of roasting meat and impending doom. Lucas was still paralyzed by my question about the federal warrant. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the impact. His hands, usually so steady when signing million-dollar contracts, were shaking uncontrollably as he fumbled for his phone. He was trying to call the legal department at Vanguard Horizons. He dialed the number, put it to his ear, and waited. The silence stretched. No one answered. He tried again. Still nothing. He did not know that 3 hours ago. I had logged into our home network router and blocked all outgoing calls to the Vanguard corporate exchange from his devices. He was screaming into a void I had created. I watched him panic, my own pulse steady. I picked up the bottle of Bordeaux and poured myself a generous refill, the liquid swirling dark and ominous in the glass. I took a slow sip and looked at him with feigned pity. I told him that they had already been here. I lied and said that agents had searched his home office while he was in the air. I told him they were asking very specific questions about wire transfers. I paused for effect, letting the words hang in the air before dropping the hammer. I said they were particularly interested in the transactions made in Napa Valley. The words Napa Valley hit him like a physical blow. His knees buckled, and he actually stumbled back against the wall for support. The color drained from his face so completely he looked like a corpse. In his mind, Napa Valley was not just where he had slept with his mistress, it was where he had funneled the stolen company funds to buy the vineyard. He thought the FBI had connected the dots. He thought he was looking at 20 years in federal prison for embezzlement and money laundering. He broke. The arrogant executive vanished, replaced by a terrified child. He rushed toward me, falling to his knees by my chair, grabbing my hands with his sweaty palms. He started babbling, confessing everything in a rush of desperate words. He admitted he took the money. He admitted he cooked the books. And then, in his panic, he admitted he was there with Monica because she was helping him set up the shell company. He begged me to help him. He asked me to call my uncle, the judge. He pleaded with me to stand by him, claiming he did it all for us, for our future. I listened until he ran out of breath. Then I laughed. It was a dry, sharp sound that startled even me. I pulled my hands away from his grip as if he were filthy. I reached under the cushion of my chair and pulled out the thick manila folder I had prepared. I threw it onto the coffee table with a heavy thud. I told him there was no FBI. There were no agents. There was no warrant. It was just me. The transformation in his face was instantaneous. The terror evaporated, replaced by a sudden blinding flash of rage. He realized he had been played. He stood up, his face flushing red with humiliation and anger. He opened his mouth to yell, to berate me for scaring him, to assert his dominance again. I did not let him speak. I reached into the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a death certificate. I held it up to his face. I told him to look at the date. I told him that while he was drinking vintage wine and sleeping with his assistant in a sun-drenched vineyard, my father was dying alone in a cold hospital room. I told him about the 48 calls I made. I told him about the text messages begging for help while he was laughing at a dinner I paid for. I told him how I sat by my father's body for hours, waiting for a husband who never came because he was too busy betraying me. The anger in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by a dawning horror. He looked at the death certificate, then at me. For the first time, he really saw me. He did not see the submissive wife who ironed his shirts. He saw a woman who had walked through hell and come back with a sword. The silence that filled the room now was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of his own monstrosity. He looked at himself through my eyes, and I could see that he was terrified of what he saw. Lucas tried to pivot. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and started a monologue about the crushing weight of expectation at Vanguard Horizons. He claimed the market volatility had pushed him to the brink and that he needed an escape to keep from snapping. He was just getting to the part where he was the victim of his own success when a shrill ringtone cut through his pathetic excuses like a knife. It was his phone. The screen lit up with the name Monica. He lunged for it, desperation etched into every feature of his face. He swiped the screen and pressed the phone to his ear, clearly hoping to hear a friendly voice, an ally in the wreckage. Instead, he pulled the phone away slightly as a high-pitched wail echoed into the silent living room. Monica was not plotting strategy. She was hysterical. I could hear her frantic voice clearly. She was screaming that Daniel knew everything. She sobbed that a courier had delivered a package to the hospital in the middle of his shift. Daniel had opened it in the break room. He had called off the wedding immediately. He had gone to their apartment, packed her bags, and thrown them onto the sidewalk. She was currently standing on a street corner in the rain, humiliated and homeless. Lucas stood frozen, listening to the destruction of his fantasy life. Before he could utter a word of comfort, I spoke up. My voice was calm, cutting through Monica's distant sobbing. I told him that Daniel was not the only one who received a special delivery today. I informed him that at 9 o'clock this morning, I had emailed a comprehensive forensic accounting report to the entire board of directors at Vanguard Horizons. Lucas lowered the phone, his eyes widening in disbelief. He looked down at the screen as a new notification banner slid into view. It was an email from the company's human resources department. The subject line was capitalized and blunt notice of immediate termination. He opened it with trembling fingers. I knew what it said. He was fired for gross misconduct and violation of fiduciary duties. His corporate access was revoked. His company credit cards were frozen. He was persona non grata at the firm he had built his identity around. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He started to say something about the house in Napa, grasping for the one thing he thought he still had. I shook my head slowly. I told him not to bother. I explained that I had contacted the bank that issued the second mortgage. I had reported the fraudulent use of my signature and the misappropriation of funds. The bank had already frozen the transaction. The Vineyard Villa was now a crime scene of financial fraud, and since the down payment was made with stolen money, the asset seizure process had already begun. The realization hit him in a wave of physical nausea. He staggered back and collapsed onto the sofa. In the span of 1 hour, his entire existence had been deleted. He had walked into this penthouse with a wife, a mistress, a high-powered job, a stellar reputation, and a secret vacation home. 60 minutes later, he had nothing. No wife, no lover, no career, no home, no money. I reached into the folder one last time and pulled out a stapled document. It was a divorce settlement agreement. I slid it across the coffee table toward him along with a pen. I gave him a simple choice. I told him he could sign the papers right now. The terms were non-negotiable. I would take 80% of all remaining marital assets, including his retirement accounts and his stock portfolio, as restitution for the emotional distress and the funds he stole. He looked at me with hatred, ready to argue. I leaned forward and delivered the final blow. I told him that if he did not sign, I would take the evidence of his tax evasion directly to the Internal Revenue Service. I reminded him that while embezzlement from a company might get him a lawsuit, tax evasion would get him a federal prison cell. I asked him if he wanted to spend the next 5 years in a cage, or if he wanted to walk out of here poor but free. He looked at the pen. He looked at me. He realized the game was over, and he had lost every single piece on the board. Lucas looked at the pen in his hand as if it were a heavy stone. The fight had drained out of him, leaving only the hollow shell of a man who realized he had gambled everything on a pair of deuces and lost. The threat of a federal tax investigation was the final straw that broke his resistance. He knew he could survive bankruptcy, but he would not survive prison. With a trembling hand, he pressed the pen to the paper. The sound of the scratching nib was the only noise in the room as he signed away his marriage, his assets, and his dignity. He pushed the documents back across the table toward me, his signature looking jagged and weak, a stark contrast to the bold autograph he usually plastered on corporate memos. He did not stand up immediately. He stayed seated, looking up at me with wet, red-rimmed eyes. He tried one last desperate play. He began to talk about the old days, his voice cracking. He brought up the library in Boston. He talked about the time we ate pizza on the floor of our first apartment because we could not afford chairs. He spoke of 12 years of memories, trying to weave a safety net out of nostalgia. He asked me how I could throw it all away, how I could be so cold to the man I had sworn to love for better or for worse. I looked at him, and I felt absolutely nothing. The space in my chest where my heart used to be was calm and quiet. I did not see the boy from the library. I saw a stranger who had desecrated my father's memory for a weekend of pleasure. I cut him off mid-sentence. My voice was steady and final. I told him that the man I loved died the same day as my father. I told him that he was just the ghost that was haunting my house, and it was time for an exorcism. I stood up and pointed to the door. I reminded him of a legal fact he had conveniently forgotten in his arrogance. This penthouse was not marital property. It was an inheritance from my mother, titled solely in my name long before he became a high-flying executive. He had no claim to the roof over his head. I told him to take his suitcase and get out. I told him he had exactly 5 minutes before I called building security to have him removed as a trespasser. Lucas stood up slowly. He looked around the room one last time. realizing that the luxury he felt entitled to was evaporating like mist. He grabbed the handle of his leather weekender bag, the one that still bore the airline tags from his flight to California. It was a poetic image. He had arrived expecting a hero's welcome, and he was leaving with nothing but his dirty laundry. He walked to the door, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As he reached for the handle, his phone rang again in his pocket. He pulled it out. It was Monica. She was likely calling back to beg him to come pick her up, to save her from the rain and the humiliation. Lucas looked at the screen, and a flash of pure bitterness crossed his face. He realized that his pursuit of her had cost him his entire life. He did not answer. He pressed the side button, silencing the call, and shoved the phone back into his pocket. He opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. The cold draft from the corridor hit him, a preview of the freezing Chicago night that awaited him outside. He looked back at me one last time, opening his mouth to speak, but I slammed the door in his face. I immediately engaged the deadbolt. I pulled out my phone and opened the smart home app, changing the digital entry code to a random string of numbers that he would never guess. The electronic lock whirred and clicked, a mechanical sound of finality that was music to my ears. For the first time in 15 days, the air in the apartment felt breathable. The suffocating weight of his lies was gone. I walked back to the living room and picked up my wine glass. I walked over to the mantel where a framed photo of my father sat. He was smiling in the picture, caught mid-laugh on a fishing trip we took years ago. I raised my glass to him. I whispered a quiet apology for not being there when he took his last breath, but I promised him that I would not waste the life he gave me. I took a long sip of the dark red wine, tasting the oak and the fruit, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the warmth of a future that belonged entirely to me. 6 months had passed since the night I changed the locks and reclaimed my life. I stood on the 14th floor of the Skyline atrium, the wind whipping through the open steel girders of the structure. This was my design. After years of shrinking myself to fit into Lucas's shadow, I had finally stepped back into the light. The sound of riveting guns and the shouting of the construction crew sounded like a symphony to me. I was no longer just a spectator in my own existence. I was the one drawing the blueprints. Earlier that morning, I had a brief, unexpected encounter that gave me a sense of closure I did not know I needed. I was grabbing an espresso at a cafe near the construction site when I saw Daniel. He was standing in line, looking tired but steady. He spotted me, and for a moment, the noise of the coffee shop faded. We did not speak. There was no need to rehash the pain or the betrayal that had connected our lives in such a violent way. He simply nodded at me, a small, sad smile touching his lips, and I nodded back. It was a silent acknowledgement between two survivors who had walked through the fire and come out the other side, scarred but standing. News travels fast in our circles, and word had eventually reached me about Lucas. He was no longer the high-flying executive dining at the French Laundry. He was living in a second-tier city 3 states away, working an entry-level sales job pushing mid-range office supplies. I heard he was living in a cramped studio apartment that smelled of damp carpet, a far cry from the penthouse he had tried to steal from me. He had lost the respect of his peers, his credit rating was destroyed, and he had aged 10 years in the span of 6 months. When I heard this, I waited for the rush of vindication. I waited to feel that dark, twisted joy of seeing an enemy fall. But it never came. Instead, I just felt a profound sense of relief. It was the feeling of a patient who is told that the surgery was successful and the tumor is gone. I did not hate him anymore. I just did not care. He was a lesson I had learned, a chapter I had finished, and a book I had closed. I left the job site and walked down to the edge of Lake Michigan. The water was a brilliant, piercing blue, stretching out to the horizon like a promise. The wind tangled my hair, but I did not bother to smooth it down. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, clean air. I was 34 years old. For a while, I had felt like my life was over. but standing there with the city skyline rising behind me, I realized I was just getting started. The past 12 years were not a waste. They were the foundation upon which I would build something stronger, something that could not be torn down by a lie. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I scrolled through the contacts until I found his name. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a pang of nostalgia. I pressed delete. The name vanished from my screen and from my life. It was a small digital act, but it felt like severing the final chain. Just as I slipped the phone back into my pocket, it buzzed. It was a number I did not recognize. I answered it, my voice steady and clear. It was a developer from New York. He had seen my preliminary sketches for the Atrium project and wanted to fly me out to discuss a potential partnership for a new skyscraper in Manhattan. I smiled. It was not the polite, deferential smile of the wife I used to be. It was the confident smile of a woman who knew her worth. I told him I would be delighted to meet. I hung up the phone and turned back toward the city. I began to walk, my heels clicking a rhythmic beat against the pavement. I was no longer the woman standing in the dark, waiting for a husband who would never come home. I was Elena. I was an architect, and I was finally building a life that belonged entirely to me. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please comment down below and tell me where you are listening from right now, because I would love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories and like this video. And if you want to support us even further, please hit that hype button to help this story reach more people.